Welcome back to the AI Policy Podcast. I'm Brielle Hill, the Associate Director for the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies. I'm back with Gregory Allen. On this episode, we're going to talk about the Wadhwani Center's latest publication on the DoD's Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, an update on U.S. AI and semiconductor export controls, and some big developments in AI regulations, including California's draft AI bill and the EU AI Act officially coming into force. Hey, Greg, it's good to be back.
Well, I'm glad we all survived because it seems like the plague has been going through CSIS and the Wadhwani Center and my family as well. So now that Brielle is over her illness, I am sort of over my illness, and we can finally have this podcast in some degree of safety and health.
Absolutely. And we can officially celebrate our most recent publication. On August 6th, our center put out a new report on the DoD's Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, the CCA. And this paper has already received a ton of coverage, including being on the cover of Defense Scoop. It was featured in Axios, Wired, and Defense One, among other outlets. And I'm wondering if you could just break down what the CCA program is.
Sure. So this is a paper that I co-authored with Isaac Goldston, who's part of the Wadhwani Center team. And it's about the, again, Collaborative Combat Aircraft Program, which is not the most exciting name, but the critical part here is what is the aircraft collaborating with and what is it? And the point is that this is an autonomous aircraft. So it is not going to be piloted by a human, and it is not going to be remotely operated like a human, which is the case of most drones around in militaries around the world so far. So this is really AI and autonomous systems collaborating with piloted aircraft. The vision for this system is that you've got piloted aircraft, fifth and sixth generation fighters, fifth generation fighter being something like the F-35. And the pilot of the F-35 is now in command of a group of fighter aircraft that is going to include some number of autonomous systems. They haven't actually decided what that's going to look like. Could be 2 aircraft that are autonomous plus 1 piloted aircraft, or maybe up to like 5 aircraft that are autonomous plus 1 aircraft that is piloted. But it's enormous news for the Department of Defense. And I realize I'm plugging my own work here, but I do encourage folks to actually go read the report because it really helps you understand just why this is such a big move for the Air Force and really the entire Department of Defense. So to give folks an understanding here, the current Air Force has some really, really big problems. And the basic story here is that the Air Force is actually pretty small in terms of its fighter fleet. It's down by about 50% in size since the end of the Cold War. And you might say that that's okay because, our newer planes are even better. But actually, a lot of our planes are old. The average age of a fighter aircraft in the United States Air Force is 30 years. And that's not the design model of the aircraft. That's the actual aircraft itself. Each individual aircraft is 30 years old. And when aircraft, accumulate a lot of flight hours on them doing really, really hard turns, that actually puts like structural wear and tear on the airframe. So if you've ever bent a paperclip back and forth a bunch of times and then it sort of falls apart, well, that same sort of thing can happen with airframes. And the U.S. Air Force, which has over 1,000 aircraft in its inventory, but those older aircraft are increasingly becoming unsafe to fly. And it's really tough to just throw money at this problem because all the aircraft that we buy are incredibly expensive. So an F-35 is around $100 million per aircraft. And that's not including the upfront costs of research and development. That's not including the full life cycle costs of maintaining and operating the aircraft. Just to build another one of these things is around $100 million. And that is just incredibly expensive. And when they're looking at what the next generation of fighter aircraft might be, those so-called sixth generation fighters, the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall, has said, it's going to be multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. So we might be going from 100 million to $500 million per aircraft. And you can't really win a war when you can only field one plane or whatever this is going to be in this incredibly expensive future. So the Air Force is looking for much, much cheaper aircraft that it can produce in much larger quantities. So as I said, right now, the Air Force has over 1,000 aircraft, less than 2,000 fighter aircraft. But in World War II, we made 98,000 aircraft every year. So the numbers have really changed here. But the problem is that we're moving from a military paradigm where small numbers of expensive, exquisite systems could reliably defeat larger numbers of lower performing systems to a new world where commercial technology is in many cases good enough that you can actually build some really impressive capabilities that are primarily derived from commercial technologies and fielded in much larger numbers. Exhibit A here would be the difference between a Iranian drone that has like cruise missile-esque capabilities but only costs like $50,000 versus like a US cruise missile, which is definitely better in every way, but costs like $2 to $3 million per thing. So the point is that like lightly militarized alterations of commercial technology can deliver some really interesting military capabilities. And the US Air Force is looking at that and basically saying, okay, if we can combine these commercially derived technologies with the US advantage in artificial intelligence and autonomous technologies, we can solve our cost problems, we can solve our number of aircraft problems, and we can actually restore US credible military deterrence, especially in plausible wars that we might have with China over Taiwan, which is really the sort of pacing challenge that a lot of the military is organizing its investments around right now. So it's a really, really big deal.
So you're saying the CCA is like a case study in how the Air Force can think about their spending moving forward.
Yeah, so that's a good way of putting it. What I sort of say is it is just one program of record, right? It's just one Air Force program, but it's sort of indicative of this paradigm change in what is the basis of military technology advantage. And one of the other things that we did in the course of doing this report, which by the way, was no great joy, was fishing through all the defense budget publications of the past 10 years because DoD leadership has been talking a big game on AI and autonomy for like over a decade now, right? The former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Robert Work, declared the third offset strategy, where autonomous systems were going to be at the heart of U.S. military power in 2015. And we still don't have autonomous big systems. So what we did is we actually traced all the investments that the DoD and the Air Force has been making in autonomous aircraft over the past 10 years. And what we found out is that the Collaborative Combat Aircraft, the CCA program, is going to spend more in its first 2 years than the 6 precursor programs across DARPA, the Air Force, the Strategic Capabilities Office. It's going to spend more than all of those 6 programs spent over the past 10.
Wow.
And then after that, it's going to like double again. So this is a $9 billion investment over the next 5 years, whereas previous DoD-wide investments in autonomous aircraft were in the $100 to $200 million range. The way that I sort of look at this program is the Air Force is sort of pushing all of their chips to the middle of the table in the poker game and saying, we're betting on autonomy. We're betting on more commercially derived technologies. It's a really interesting moment for the U.S. Department of Defense and military technology writ large.
So from reading the paper, which I hope all of our listeners are going to do immediately following this podcast.
It's a real page turner.
It is enthralling. But what's interesting is not only what they're purchasing, but how they're going about it. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think the CCA program has really adopted some of the lessons learned of recent DoD procurements, which, to be perfectly honest, doesn't always go great, right? There's a long history of programs that come in over budget, come in super late, and cost more than they were hoping they would cost, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's a few interesting things that the DoD is doing in this program, which Isaac and I went into in the paper. The first of which is, rather than going through the sort of traditional requirements process and saying, basically, build us this plane, the Air Force actually gave industry a pretty blank canvas and said, hey, we're interested in autonomous collaborative aircraft that are going to sort of be the loyal wingmen of our manned piloted aircraft. So tell us what you would do, industry. What do you think is the right thing for us to go out and buy? And by giving industry the opportunity to be creative, which was the Air Force's explicit intention, they got some really interesting proposals. There were 5 companies who were invited to submit a bid as the prime contractor. There's sort of a larger universe of dozens of companies that are involved to some greater or lesser extent with this program. And that, I think, is really interesting. Now, they do have requirements in the form of this autonomy government reference architecture, which I realize does not exactly roll off the tongue. But what I think the Air Force is doing right here is they're really focusing on interoperability and standards. They're not saying you must build this aircraft. They're really saying that your aircraft must use these communication protocols and it must use these software interfaces. And that's really about preserving modularity and interoperability so that when one company makes something, the Air Force can have confidence that it's going to work with something that another company is building. So other than that, they're kind of giving industry a blank canvas, which I think is really good and sparks innovation. The second thing that I think is interesting here is that they have preserved opportunities for competition later in the life cycle of the program. So right now, 2 companies, Anduril and General Atomics, have been selected to develop the prototypes for the increment 1 of the system. So if you're one of the 3 companies that was not selected, which is Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing, you might be saying, oh, well, we lost and this program is over and maybe now we hate CCA and wish it would get canceled, right? But actually, what the Air Force is saying is, hey, there's going to be an increment 2. And just because you didn't get a contract in increment 1 doesn't mean you can't get a contract in increment 2. But what it does mean is like these are the companies who we're going to be giving money to further the design that they proposed. If you want to stay in the game, you need to put up your own money. And that's actually something that has worked in the space industry acquisition sector previously. For the folks who build the rockets that launch military satellites into space, previously there was 2 companies, United Launch Alliance and SpaceX. And Blue Origin, a company I actually used to work at, did not win the first increment of the launch services agreement contract. But Blue Origin said, we still think this is interesting. We're still going to invest our own money in developing a rocket that is useful to the national security customer base. And then they came back, and even though SpaceX and ULA had received government subsidies to work on their own designs, Blue Origin, without those subsidies, still came up with something that was competitive enough that they were awarded a services contract. So I think that's proof, right, that you can actually increase the strength of the competitive landscape, give the government a good position to keep costs down and keep pressure on companies to keep performing, and all in all, looking good. One final thing worth noting is the selection of Anduril. And this isn't really a reason to select Anduril. Obviously, the DoD should just be picking who has the best proposal at the best price, with the best performance, et cetera. But one interesting consequence is because Anduril is a venture capital backed, at one point, it was very clearly a startup. Now it's pretty big. But because it's still a venture capital backed company, what this contract, again, the overall budget for this program is $8.9 billion. Not all of that's going to go to Anduril, but a lot of that money is probably going to go to Anduril. And what that says to the venture capital community, to the entrepreneurial community, is that you actually can win in the defense technology marketplace. This is not just somewhere where the same old companies win over and over and over again. Things really are changing. New entrants can win. And that is a really powerful message to the entrepreneurial community and to Silicon Valley and the venture capital community, et cetera. So all of which is to say, looking good. In the paper, we also detail some of our concerns about the program and sort of the unanswered questions of the program, which I won't go into in this podcast, but I will just say that they're riveting and you should definitely go read the paper.
Well, you can definitely access the paper in the show notes from today's podcast. We'll make sure to include that. We'll move on now to some big news in the world of U.S. export controls. What can you tell us about what's going on?
Yeah, so there's been 2 really big reporting stories that came out. One is from the New York Times by Anna Swanson and Claire Fu, and the other is from The Information by Chianar Liu. And these are some pretty big scoops that these reporters got. So what happened? Basically, there had already been some stories about the U.S. AI chip export controls being circumvented by smugglers. But what those previous stories in Reuters and other publications had found is like smuggling in like the dozens of chips kind of a thing. Now, when you talk about building the big AI data center supercomputer that can train like a ChatGPT or like what the next generation of these large languages models are going to be, you're not talking like a dozen chips. You're talking like 100,000 chips, right? So the smuggling that had been covered to date was all this really low-level amateur smuggling that really does not have a plausible path to having a strategic impact. Well, this New York Times story and this information story, they actually interviewed smugglers. They actually talked about what types of smuggling tactics they use. And what they uncovered is smuggling not in the dozens of chips, but smuggling in the thousands of chips kind of a range. Both the New York Times and the information talked to folks who were talking about transactions of smuggled NVIDIA chips in the $100 million range. And what that means is we now might be approaching a level where the smuggling is reaching a strategic level. And one other thing, which is something that I had previously predicted in my writing on this topic, and unfortunately it's like kind of depressing to be right in this case, but basically there was no chip smuggling to China between October 2022, when the first controls were put into place, and October 2023, when the updated controls were put in place. And that's because the NVIDIA chip that had been modified specifically for the Chinese market, this is the difference between the A100 and the A800, or the H100 and the H800. The 800 series is an inferior chip modified to comply with the original round of export controls. Well, that performance hit was only 15 to 20%, which stinks, right? You want every drop of performance per dollar you can possibly get, but it wasn't significant enough to justify setting up a massive smuggling ring. But after the October 2023 export controls, which were much more draconian, really restricted how good chips could be when they're going to get sold to China, what this reporting reveals is that large-scale smuggling really did start to get set up. And so since October 2023 to today in August, the number of smugglers has been growing, the sophistication of the smuggling rings has been growing, and the question is, does the United States Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security really have what it takes to detect these smuggling networks and shut down these smuggling networks? And unfortunately, they've grown pretty sophisticated. It used to be the case that the U.S. government would say, yeah, the Russian smugglers are pretty talented because they have this long heritage of Soviet Union era smuggling, and Chinese smugglers, by contrast, are like less sophisticated. But what's talked about in these stories, which again, you really should go read these articles. It's some really good journalism. These tactics are pretty sophisticated and they're pretty impressive.
What do you mean? What were they doing? How were they sophisticated?
So, for example, NVIDIA, which is the top producer of AI chips, they have to send an inspector when you buy a certain number of chips. Either NVIDIA or NVIDIA's distributor will send an inspector. And I think the standard, which was revealed in the information story, is when you buy 200 servers worth of chips. So a server typically has 8 NVIDIA H100 chips. Each one of these chips might cost you like $40,000. So these servers are expensive. And when you buy more than 200 of them, NVIDIA or one of its distributors, after say, 30 days, will come out and inspect your data center. And they'll just make sure that everything is built out according to proper specifications so that like that company is going to be eligible to exercise its warranty, right? Because if you set up the data center in a stupid way and the chips catch on fire, well, that's your fault for setting it up a stupid way. That's not NVIDIA's fault. And so when NVIDIA sends these inspectors, it's to make sure they're eligible for the warranty and then also to sort of keep its fingers on the pulse of what's going on in the AI market, how its chips are being used, develop a relationship with the end users. Well, so what the information story revealed is that there is a network of Chinese shell companies who will order a bunch of chips, set up a data center in, say, Malaysia, and then literally after the NVIDIA inspector comes, they will tear down that very real data center, cut open all the innards, and ship all those innards to China.
Wow.
So if you're NVIDIA, you're like, I inspected that facility. I know where those chips are. But they only send one inspector. They only send it one time. And as soon as the inspector's gone, all of that stuff, they built a full data center, right, in Malaysia. All that stuff is torn down, shipped to China. So like I was saying, this is a level of sophistication and seriousness and resourcing that the U.S. government is not used to seeing from Chinese smuggling networks. And they upped their game because they, like the U.S. government, think that AI is an incredibly strategic industry and it's worth going to these lengths to do it.
So you and many in the community have been screaming from the top of your lungs to increase funding to BIS for a long time now. What do you imagine they're doing right now?
What I have been saying since since I got to CSIS, right, in 2022, this was literally one of the first papers I wrote when I got here, was that after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States talked a really big game on what we were going to do to Russia's economy, what we were going to do to Russia's defense industrial base, and export controls was a big part of that story. And there was very famously a senior executive at a Russian weapons company who said, yeah, right, it is impossible for you to cut us off from the global technology economy. We're not worried, right? And that for me, that was like Russia throwing down the gauntlet. And the reality is that basically U.S. politicians were talking a big game about what export controls were going to accomplish, and that job falls to BIS. They're the first line of defense. They're pretty much the last line of defense, too, when it comes to export controls. And so their job, I'm just making up a number here, but like what I often say is like their job got 10 times harder after Russia invaded Ukraine because the number of stuff we were controlling went vastly up. The diversity of things we were controlling, the seriousness of the adversary to circumvent those controls went way up. So what happened to BIS's budget? Well, it actually like went down in inflation adjusted terms. And then, right, that's like in February, April 2022. Then in October 2022, they enacted this other policy around AI chip export controls to China, which from my perspective, that overturned 25 years of trade and technology policy towards China. I think it's the second most important foreign policy action that the Biden administration took that year in 2022. And export controls, again, are at the heart of that policy. And what happened to BIS's budget? It went down, in inflation-adjusted terms. Now you've got the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, loudly talking about how they need more resources. I think she's right. I really hope she wins that argument. But they also really needed these resources back in 2022. And so that's what I hope is going on. I hope the U.S. government is asking itself, what is it going to take for these export controls to actually be effective? Are we resourcing appropriately? Because, compromise in American politics has a really good reputation, but there's sometimes when compromise is really stupid, right? If you're choosing to build your house on one side of a river or the other side of the river, the dumbest thing you can do is compromise and split the difference and build your house in the middle of the river, right? Because then you're just going to sink and drown. So you need to choose one action or the other, and you should not compromise. And I feel like what's happened here is you have folks in the U.S. government who've said, hey, we really need to get serious about China's AI ambitions and the threat that they pose to U.S. national security. We need to be willing to take strict measures and do what it takes to win. And then you have other people who are arguing, well, actually, free trade is great, and what we really need is revenue from selling to China, and that's going to be the source of our technological advantage. So we shouldn't have strict export controls. And the policy that we've now landed at is this middle-of-the-river disaster where we have a strict export controls policy, but we have really weak enforcement resources available to the people charged with executing that policy. And I just really hope that changes, and I really hope it changes soon.
Okay, so we're going to move on to AI regulations now. Something we haven't talked about much on this podcast at all is U.S. state and local regulations or proposed regulations. And so we're going to start in California, a bill that we have been tracking on our team for a little bit, but we want to introduce in the podcast today. What the heck is going on in California?
Yeah, You're totally right. We haven't really talked about state and local regulation, even though there is some interesting stuff going on. But California absolutely rises to the threshold of importance. And there's some obvious reasons. Number one is just the nature of this regulation is designed to have a big impact. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But the second thing is obviously a lot of the AI companies are in California. So if this regulation goes into effect, it has worldwide implications, right? Because it's going to affect all of these companies that have global impact. So before we get into the meat of the AI proposal in the California legislature, I think it's worth contrasting it with the EU AI Act. So the EU AI Act had been in the works since, I want to say like 2019, right? They had been working on that piece of legislation forever. And then in 2022, ChatGPT happened. So when they were originally writing the EU AI Act, it was not about large language models. It was not about frontier AI capabilities or super advanced AI systems. it was really about what we would now call like standard machine learning or old school deep learning.
Right.
It's crazy to think of that as like old school when at one point it was revolutionary. So when ChatGPT happened, it was a surprise to the folks who were writing the EU AI Act. And they kind of went back retroactively and were like, oh, okay, we're going to write something about general purpose AI systems, right? Because previously AI systems had been application specific, right? This AI system is good at recognizing cats in pictures. It is not good at transcribing speech in audio. But now you have these multimodal large language models or other types of general AI systems that can do a lot of different things, and you need a regulatory regime that takes into account that fact. Well, the California bill, by contrast, kind of only cares about the super advanced AI systems. They're sort of looking at like the old school machine learning stuff, old school deep learning stuff, and saying not even worth our time and attention. And I think the way to situate this California bill is that it is sort of descended from the same line of argument that the Bletchley Park Summit, the UK AI Safety Summit, was focused on, which is AI systems are really, really capable today. But perhaps even more importantly, they're getting more capable all the time and seemingly at an exponentially accelerating rate. So what we're interested in from a regulatory perspective is not just what could a bad person do with ChatGPT, but like what could a bad person do with the great-great-great-great-great-grandchild of ChatGPT, which in 10 years might be 1,000 times more powerful or something like that. Mm-hmm. So that's what this bill is about. This bill is about AI safety in advanced AI systems, and it puts a lot of pretty intense regulations on the developers of advanced AI systems that is designed to get after the existential risk or catastrophic risk that was mentioned in that open letter published way back in May 2023.
So what are some of those contents?
I don't want to get into like all the weeds here, but there's a difference between the California Senate version of the bill and the California Assembly version of the bill.
Okay.
So there are some differences here. Rather than going into the weeds on each of these, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the general things. And some of them might not apply to each individual version. But they're talking about like having a kill switch, like a button that you can push to like shut down all the AI systems. They're talking about setting up legal liability standards. So for example, could a model developer be liable for being negligent in the development of their advanced AI system, right? Like if you just fail to implement appropriate safety protocols, which have to be defined, but if you fail to implement appropriate safety protocols, could you be legally liable even if no harm has occurred, right? So you built a dangerous thing, and even if nothing bad happened, we can still fine you a lot of money or something like that. And then perhaps the least controversial provision of this legislation is whistleblower protections. So you may recall that there was some news a while ago that when some folks were leaving OpenAI, some of them went on background and talked to reporters about a pretty strict non-disclosure agreement that OpenAI made them sign in order to keep all of their stock that they had earned during the time that they had worked at OpenAI. And very famously, some folks who left OpenAI refused to sign it, like literally gave away millions of dollars in stock because they said there's major AI safety issues here that the world needs to know about, and I would rather tell the world about this than make my millions of dollars. And what this legislation would aim at is giving employees a mechanism to talk to the government about safety risks of AI systems without worrying that there's going to be some kind of non-disclosure violation or they're going to face some kind of legal retaliation. I think that part of the provision is the one that's talked about the most because it has the most widespread support. Some of the other provisions are pretty controversial, and this legislation, I think overall, has kind of split the AI community between the folks who really want it and the folks who really don't want it.
What are some of the arguments against it? I know that some of the companies are calling for regulations themselves. A lot of policymakers have been looking at this issue. We certainly talk about it. But what is the controversy stemming from in this particular bill?
So I'm not aware of a company that's supporting this bill at this stage, right? Google, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, all companies who have talked a lot about the importance of AI safety, all companies who have, to some greater or lesser extent, talked about their support for AI regulation related to safety, but they're all coming out against this bill and basically saying that the way that it is designed is going to really slow down AI development without really providing the safety benefits that it's purporting to do it. And now some of the changes that, for example, Anthropic requested for are now reflected in the assembly version. So they're kind of still hashing out what this bill is going to look like. But in general, the companies are against it, and pretty loudly so. On the academic side, of note, 2 of the 3 sort of like godfathers of deep learning AI, which is obviously the incredible run that we've been on for a little over a decade now, Yoshua Bengio and Jeffrey Hinton have authored a letter to key California lawmakers urging them to pass this bill. And I think what's really interesting is Hinton in particular has described this bill as, quote, the bare minimum for effective regulation of this technology. So he's taken a really strong stance, basically saying that these types of measures are required. This is stuff like when you are submitting safety test results, would you do that under penalty of perjury? You know, like if you get it wrong, if you said anything that turns out not to be true, you're now facing legal consequences or criminal liability for that, versus like a lesser standard for information that is reported to the government where, you know, every once in a while you make a mistake and that can be dealt with as appropriate, but there's not an immediate resort to criminal penalties. Anyway, so Yann LeCun, who's the third one of these folks who was one of the early pioneers of deep learning, he's obviously now Meta's chief AI scientist, and he's very, very against this regulation. So it's dividing the AI community. It's a really important development, whatever happens. Just my sort of gut sense right now is that something is going to pass. Something is going to pass in California. I would say the minimum thing that's likely to pass is the whistleblower protections. So somewhere between only whistleblower protections and this pretty intense California Senate draft, something like that I would say is going to pass. And now this also ties into the presidential election because, you know, as we mentioned on a previous podcast, both former President Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris have actually mentioned AI in their party platforms and as something that they actually care about, and, you know, that there's now a community of donors, at least, if not the general public voters, but at least a community of donors who really care about this issue.
So in the context setting, you discussed how this was brought about, this California bill was brought about in an age of general purpose technology. And then the EU AI Act had been pre what we see and think of today as AI.
Well, with some last minute modifications.
Of course, of course. So we talk a lot about precedent setting here. Do you foresee this California bill having any implications on the EU AI Act moving forward?
That's a good question, and one that I hadn't really thought about. It certainly could be the case, right? So if there's going to be testing, if there's going to be testing under government review, especially if that's like testing under penalty of perjury, that's kind of different from what's going on in, say, the US AI Safety Institute, where the companies have all volunteered and asked the government to test their systems. But that's like a collaborative, cooperative kind of a thing. This would be with the risk of major fines or criminal liability in the California version of the story. So whatever the standards come up that have criminal liability, the EU is obviously going to be paying attention to that and wonder if they should do the same thing. The other thing I guess that's worth pointing out here is the EU is already, not everybody in the EU, but some factions in the EU are kind of expressing buyer's remorse over the EU AI Act and basically saying, oh my gosh, did we push regulation too far? Have we made it so that companies are not going to want to develop their AI systems in the EU? And if California comes out with this, well, I think they'll feel a lot more comfortable regulating a lot more strictly.
Yeah, well, speaking of the EU AI Act, I believe it entered into force at the beginning of this month.
Yeah, August 1st was that milestone. Entering into force, not necessarily what you think. You might think like, okay, now it's happening. But actually, what entering into force mostly means is that a lot of other clocks have now started.
Okay.
So again, August 1st, 2024, that's when it entered into force. None of the Act's requirements apply immediately. They begin to apply over time. So in February 2025, 6 months later, the prohibitions on unacceptable AI risk apply. That's stuff like social scoring using AI, certain categories of biometric surveillance, so on and so forth. So that's like when the unacceptable rules apply. Then there's also the general purpose AI rules apply. This is the part of the EU AI Act that we're talking about before that they kind of added at the last minute to deal with stuff like large language models. Well, that's only going to enter into effect August 2nd, 2025. So they have 12 months to design what these regulations actually mean. So there's some requirements for what has to be in the final rules as they apply. But they have 12 months to come up with these standards that are really the meat of the regulation. So on the one hand, it's like a huge milestone. On the other hand, not a lot is going to happen right away.
And so it's been out in the open for quite some time. We've had some time to pour through it. We talk about it in comparison to what the U.S. is doing. Is it having the intended effect so far, or what are the indications pointing to at this point?
Yeah, so I mentioned a moment ago a little bit of buyer's remorse on the part of the EU. Obviously, not everybody in the EU feels that way, but there was one interview with an EU Commission official in a Bloomberg article, Gabriele Mazzini, and he said, this is a quote I think it's worth reading, "The regulatory bar maybe has been set too high. There may be many companies in Europe that could just say there isn't enough legal certainty in the AI Act to proceed." Right? So this is a person who's in the EU Commission. He's been a part of AI regulatory discussions for a long time. In general, was pro-regulation and is now sort of wondering if they got it wrong. Now, they do have a lot of flexibility in terms of like what are the standards that are really the meat of the compliance requirements applying to companies. But it's kind of interesting that, like, at the same time the EU is wondering whether or not it should be walking back, California has this faction, at least, that wants to press ahead.
Well, as always on this podcast, we're going to continue to follow all of the international AI legislative work streams. I encourage all of our readers to take a look at that CCA report that came out earlier this month. It really is a good one. And we'll be back in a couple of weeks on the AI Policy Podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We'd also love to hear from you, so reach out to aipolicypodcast@csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. And finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by David Lutfi, Isaac Goldston, Sadie McCullough, Teddy Foley, Sam Gonzalez, and Irina Petrick. See you next time.